A young woman vanishes in a quiet Austrian town, and the truth stays hidden under her own family home. For 24 years, the outside world believes she simply ran away, another troubled teenager who disappeared and never came back. But the reality is almost impossible to process. She was still there the entire time, trapped in a concealed cellar, locked away behind concrete and secrecy, just feet below the life that continued without her. And the secret doesn't come out because of a confession, or a breakthrough tip, or a dramatic police raid. It surfaces because a teenage girl collapses, critically ill, neglected for years, and a hospital starts asking the kinds of questions that no lie can survive. The story that follows isn't just about one missing person. What police eventually uncover isn't just a disappearance. It's a long-term system of captivity, control, and calculated deception, built to last, maintained for decades, and hidden in plain sight. The victim at the center of this case is Elizabeth Fritzl. She was born on April 6, 1966, and she was from Amstetten, in Lower Austria. Elizabeth was the daughter of Joseph Fritzl and Rosemary Fritzl, raised inside what has been described as a strict household. There were later reports of strict and abusive behavior within the family environment, but the full extent of what was happening at the time was unknown, not confirmed to the outside world. From the outside, this was not a family people pointed to as a warning sign. It was a home that blended into the neighborhood, a name that didn't stand out until it did. As Elizabeth grew older, she completed compulsory education and began training to become a waitress. On paper, it looked like a straightforward path forward, a young woman preparing for adulthood, trying to build a life of her own. But something about her home life was pushing her toward escape. In January of 1983, Elizabeth ran away to Vienna. It wasn't a spontaneous moment of rebellion. It was a decision serious enough that she went into hiding with a friend from work. But it didn't last. Police found her within 3 weeks and she was returned home. That moment matters because later, after she vanished, this became part of the explanation people accepted. When a teenager runs away once, people can convince themselves she might do it again. It creates doubt. It creates a story that sounds plausible enough for everyone to stop digging, to stop asking questions, to stop imagining the worst. Elizabeth returned and she continued her training. By mid-1984, she had finished her waitress course and was offered a job in Linz. The exact start date is unknown, not confirmed, but what's clear is that she was standing on the edge of a new chapter. She was 18 years old now, legally an adult, old enough to leave, old enough to work, old enough to make her own choices. To someone watching from the outside, it could have looked like she was finally getting away from the tension of home. But on August 28, 1984, Elizabeth never got the chance. That day, Joseph Fritzl lured his 18-year-old daughter into the basement of the family home. The reason he gave sounded ordinary, almost boring. He told her he needed help carrying a door. It's the kind of request that doesn't trigger alarm bells. A father asking his daughter for help with something heavy, something awkward, something physical. It's the kind of moment that happens in homes everywhere, the kind of moment you forget as soon as it's over. Except this one didn't end. Because in reality, Joseph had been converting the basement into something else entirely. A concealed chamber, a hidden space meant to imprison someone. And the door wasn't just a door, it was part of the plan. The final piece needed to seal off the area from the rest of the house. Elizabeth went down there with him. She held the door in place while Joseph fitted it into the frame. And when it was done, when the last barrier was set, Joseph made his move. He used an ether-soaked towel to knock her unconscious. There was no warning, no time to process what was happening. In an instant, Elizabeth's world went dark. When she woke up, she wasn't upstairs. She wasn't free. She wasn't even in a place anyone would think to look. Joseph had imprisoned her in the concealed chamber beneath the family home. Above ground, the disappearance was immediate and obvious. Elizabeth didn't come back, she didn't show up, and her mother, Rosemary, reported her missing. That part is documented, a missing persons report, the beginning of what should have been a search, a community looking for an 18-year-old who had just vanished. But then the narrative shifted, because Joseph controlled it. About a month later, Joseph delivered a letter to police. It was a letter forced from Elizabeth, postmarked from Braun, claiming she had left voluntarily. It said she was tired of living with her family. It warned her parents not to look for her and suggested that if they tried, she would leave the country. It wasn't just a note saying goodbye. It was written to shut down the search, to create distance, to make sure everyone understood that finding her wasn't wanted. And then Joseph added the final piece of the story. He suggested Elizabeth had joined a cult. It's hard to overstate how effective that one word can be in a case like this. Cult explains everything and nothing at the same time. It creates mystery, fear, and confusion. It makes people imagine secrecy, brainwashing, isolation, and a group that hides its members. It makes a disappearance feel unsolvable. And in Elizabeth's case, it fit too neatly with what people already knew, that she had run away before, that she had tried to escape home life in the past. So for years, the world accepted the version Joseph gave them, a young woman who left, a runaway, someone who didn't want to be found, a missing person case that slowly went cold. But beneath that ordinary explanation was something far worse. Elizabeth Fritzl had not gone anywhere. She had not left Austria. She had not joined a cult. She was trapped beneath the very house where her family continued living, hidden behind layers of locks and lies, imprisoned in a concealed cellar. And for 24 years, no one outside that home understood what had actually happened to her. The case began as a missing person mystery, another name, another file, another unanswered question. But it would eventually become one of the most horrifying crimes in modern history, not because of how quickly it happened, but because of how long it lasted. Down in the concealed space beneath the Fritzl home, captivity wasn't chaotic. It was structured. It was routine. And that's part of what makes this case so disturbing, because Joseph Fritzl didn't just commit a single crime and disappear. He built a system that he could maintain for years, and then decades, without the outside world ever seeing what he was doing. According to what investigators later uncovered, Joseph entered the hidden area frequently. He brought food and supplies, just enough to keep Elizabeth alive, just enough to keep her dependent. And he repeatedly assaulted her throughout the years she was held there. The cellar wasn't simply a place where Elizabeth was hidden. It was a controlled environment where Joseph could decide when she ate, when she slept, when she was allowed to speak, and when she was punished. Control wasn't maintained only through physical confinement. It was psychological. Joseph used threats that shaped how Elizabeth and the children understood their world. He told them that if they tried to escape, they would be killed. He claimed the chamber could be flooded with gas. He claimed they would be electrocuted if they interfered with the door or tried to force it open. Investigators later concluded that the gas threat was an empty one. There was no gas supply to the basement. But for the people trapped inside, that detail didn't matter. They didn't have access to the truth. They only had his word and the reality that every attempt at resistance could bring consequences. And when Joseph wanted to reinforce his power, he didn't always need violence. Sometimes he punished them by cutting off the lights. Sometimes he withheld food for days. In a space already defined by isolation and deprivation, those punishments weren't just cruel. They were a reminder that survival itself depended on obedience. The physical conditions inside the concealed chamber were equally brutal, and they were designed to keep people contained. The space was initially around 35 square meters. Later, it was expanded to about 55 square meters. But even at its largest, it wasn't a home. It was an underground enclosure, sealed away from daylight, sealed away from help, sealed away from any normal sense of time. Inside, the environment was defined by artificial light and poor air. During the trial, the cellar was described as damp and moldy. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unhealthy. The air was stale, the walls held moisture, and everything about it carried the sense of a place never meant for human life, especially not for children. And getting to it wasn't simple. Multiple locked doors separated the normal basement from the hidden chamber. This wasn't a single locked room someone might stumble across. It was concealed behind layers of barriers, doors within doors, locked spaces that made access difficult even for someone who lived in the house. The structure itself became part of the crime, a design meant to delay discovery, to prevent escape, and to keep the people inside completely cut off. Within that confined space, there was a basic setup for survival. There were sleeping areas. There was a small bathroom. Food could be cooked or heated on hot plates. Supplies could be stored in a refrigerator. These details might sound almost ordinary when listed, but in context they become even more chilling because they show planning. This wasn't improvised. It was built to last. Over time, limited media access was introduced. A television, a radio, and a video cassette player. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't comfort. But it became one of the only ways Elizabeth and the children could understand that an outside world even existed. And inside that closed environment, Elizabeth did what she could to create a sense of structure for her children. She taught them to read and write, using whatever limited resources were available. In a space designed to erase identity and time, she tried to preserve both. But none of it changed the reality of what was happening there, because the captivity wasn't only Elizabeth's. Over the years, it became a place where children were born. The children were the result of incestuous rape. In total, there were 7 pregnancies connected to the captivity, and 7 children were born, though only 6 survived. In November 1986, Elizabeth suffered a miscarriage in the 10th week of pregnancy. Even that fact, stated plainly, carries weight. It's a reminder that the violence was ongoing, and that the conditions of captivity were dangerous enough that even basic medical crises were faced without help. Then, on August 30th, 1988, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter, Kirsten. Kirsten remained in the cellar until 2008. She would spend her entire childhood and adolescence underground, in a space that most people wouldn't even describe as livable. On February 1st, 1990, Elizabeth gave birth to a son, Stefan. Like Kirsten, Stefan remained in the cellar until 2008. These weren't children who were hidden for a short time. They were raised in captivity, growing up in artificial light, confined air, and a reality shaped entirely by fear and limited space. On August 29, 1992, Elizabeth gave birth to another daughter, Lisa. But Lisa's story took a different path. She was removed from the cellar and raised upstairs. In May 1993, she was found outside the family home, presented as a child left behind by Elizabeth. This was the beginning of a pattern that Joseph used to strengthen his deception, one that would convince not only his wife, but also authorities that the story of Elizabeth's disappearance was real. On February 26, 1994, Elizabeth gave birth again, this time to Monica. Like Lisa, Monica was removed from the cellar and raised upstairs. In December 1994, she was found outside the entrance of the house, again presented as an abandoned child. Then on April 28, 1996, Elizabeth gave birth to twins, Michael and Alexander. One of the twins, Michael, died after less than 3 days. Joseph cremated the body. The other twin, Alexander, survived, but he was later removed from the cellar and raised upstairs as well, taken out when he was approximately 15 months old. And years later, on December 16, 2002, Elizabeth gave birth to Felix. Felix was kept in the cellar with Elizabeth. By this point, the hidden chamber wasn't holding one victim. It was holding a family, created through violence, sustained through control, and trapped beneath the same house where another family life continued as if nothing was wrong. While Elizabeth and some of her children lived underground, Joseph built an entirely separate reality above ground. He convinced his wife, Rosemary, and the authorities that the infants he brought upstairs were foundlings, children left behind by Elizabeth. He constructed a narrative where Elizabeth was alive but absent, where she appeared only through letters and staged abandonments, leaving Bobbies behind for her parents to raise. And somehow, that story held. Social workers visited the Fritzl home. They saw the children being cared for. They found nothing suspicious. They did not discover the truth beneath the house. And a critical detail later emerged. Joseph's earlier rape conviction from 1967 had been expunged after 15 years, meaning that background checks didn't reveal the history that might have raised serious concerns. On paper, he did not appear as a convicted sexual offender. To the system, he looked like a man stepping in to care for children who had been abandoned. And so the deception continued. The upstairs children, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, grew up in the family home under a false story. Meanwhile, underground, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix remained trapped with Elizabeth, living in a concealed space with limited air, artificial light, and a constant fear of Joseph's control. And one of the most haunting questions in this case is how no one realized for decades. There were people in and around that house. Tenants rented rooms. Some reported hearing noises coming from the basement, but Joseph had an explanation ready. He blamed pipes. He blamed the heating system. In an ordinary home, those excuses might sound plausible. In this home, they became part of the cover that protected the secret. Above ground, family life continued. Joseph maintained strict control. There was limited questioning. And the longer the lie lasted, the more normal it began to feel to the people living inside it. That's how cases like this survive. Not because the truth isn't horrifying, but because the deception is steady, repetitive, and reinforced until no one believes there's anything left to uncover. For 24 years, Elizabeth's life was reduced to survival in a hidden underground chamber. Joseph built a system of fear, punishment, and routine, while staging an entirely separate reality upstairs, where 3 of the children grew up believing a lie. The horror isn't just what happened below, it's how long it stayed invisible. In the end, what brought down Joseph Fritzl's entire world of secrecy wasn't a confession. It wasn't a suspicious neighbor finally calling the police. It wasn't a hidden camera, or a long overdue search warrant, or an investigator refusing to let the case go cold. It was a medical emergency. On April 19, 2008, Kirsten, 19 years old, collapsed unconscious inside the hidden cellar. After a lifetime spent underground, her body finally reached a breaking point. And for the first time in 24 years, Joseph was faced with a problem he couldn't solve behind a locked door. He agreed to seek medical attention, and Kirsten was taken to Landesklinicum Amsden, the local hospital. On the surface, this could have looked like a concerned family member rushing someone in crisis to get help. But from the moment Joseph arrived, the story he told didn't sit right. He claimed he had found a note written by Kirsten's mother. That note, along with the condition Kirsten was in and the circumstances surrounding her arrival, raised questions almost immediately. One of the doctors involved was Albert Reiter, and he found aspects of Joseph's account puzzling. The details didn't fit together cleanly. The explanations didn't answer the most basic question. Why was a 19-year-old in such severe condition, with no clear medical history, appearing in a hospital under such strange circumstances? By April 21st, hospital staff alerted the police. This is one of the most critical turning points in the entire case, because it meant the story was no longer contained within Joseph's control. Once law enforcement became involved, the lies had to withstand scrutiny, and scrutiny is exactly what they received. Police issued a public appeal for the missing mother to come forward and provide Kirsten's medical history. The appeal went out broadly, through public media, because the hospital needed information, and because nothing about this situation felt routine. And with that appeal, something else happened. The investigation into Elizabeth Fritzl's disappearance was reopened. For years, Elizabeth had been treated as someone who left voluntarily. But now, Her name was back in the system again, tied to a critically ill young woman and a strange, inconsistent story. Joseph, as he had done for decades, tried to reinforce his narrative. He presented what he claimed was the most recent letter from Elizabeth, dated January 2008 and postmarked from the town of Kemme. It was meant to prove she was alive, still absent, still choosing not to return. It was meant to keep the police looking outward, searching for a missing woman who, in reality, had never left the property. But the letter didn't solve the problem. If anything, it deepened it. Police contacted Manfred Wohlfahrt, a church officer and an expert on cults, because Joseph's story, once again, leaned on the idea that Elizabeth had joined some kind of cult or group. Wohlfahrt raised doubts about the existence of the group Joseph described, and he noted something else that stood out. Elizabeth's letters seemed dictated and oddly written. That detail matters, because when a letter sounds like it's been written under control, when the language feels unnatural, stiff, or forced, it stops being proof of freedom. It becomes evidence of coercion. By this point, Joseph was under pressure in a way he hadn't experienced in decades. Kirsten was in the hospital, the police were asking questions, the media was making appeals, and experts were publicly casting doubt on the cult story. The tight control he'd maintained for 24 years was beginning to crack, not because someone discovered the cellar by accident, but because the lie itself could no longer hold up. Then came the moment he had likely spent years trying to prevent. On April 26, 2008, Joseph released Elizabeth, along with Stefan and Felix, from the cellar. It's difficult to fully grasp what that means. Elizabeth had been held captive since August 1984. She had spent 24 years in a concealed underground chamber, separated from the outside world by multiple locked doors and a system designed to keep her hidden. And now, suddenly, she was being brought back upstairs, into the same house where her captivity had been concealed for so long. But this was not a rescue. This was not a moment of freedom given willingly. It was a decision made under pressure, with Joseph still trying to control the outcome. That same day, police detained Joseph and Elizabeth at the hospital grounds after a tip-off that the Fritzls were there. Authorities separated them and took them to a police station for questioning. And even then, even with police officers in the room, Elizabeth didn't immediately tell them what had happened. Because fear doesn't disappear just because a door opens. Elizabeth initially refused to provide details until police promised her one thing, that she would never have to see her father again. That promise became the line between silence and survival, and once she had it, she began to speak. Over the next 2 hours, Elizabeth provided an account of her captivity, held underground for decades, and the repeated rape she endured. The story wasn't vague. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a complicated family dispute. It was a description of a crime that had lasted nearly a quarter of a century. And once Elizabeth's statement was given, the case changed instantly. It was no longer a missing persons file reopened due to a hospital appeal. It was a live investigation into rape, enslavement, and imprisonment happening inside a family home. Joseph was arrested, and with his arrest came another horrifying confirmation. He knew exactly how to access the hidden chamber, and he showed investigators how to enter it using the concealed entry system and code. It wasn't a place he'd forgotten. It wasn't a hidden corner of the basement he avoided. It was a space he controlled with precision, built, maintained, and accessed deliberately. On April 29th, DNA evidence confirmed what the investigation was already pointing toward. Joseph Fritzl was the biological father of Elizabeth's children. That confirmation erased any remaining doubt about the central claim of incest. It connected Joseph directly to the children whose existence had been explained away for years. And it turned the deception upstairs, those foundlings, those staged arrivals, into something much darker. As prosecutors and investigators moved forward, The charges were staggering. The indictment included rape, incest, kidnapping, false imprisonment, coercion, and enslavement. These weren't just labels. They were the legal language for what had happened in that house and what had happened beneath it. And there was another charge that cut through the horror in a different way: murder by negligence. That charge related to infant Michael, one of the twins born in captivity. He died shortly after birth, and according to the case background, he received no medical help. Joseph cremated the body. Investigators and prosecutors treated that death not as an unavoidable tragedy, but as the result of deliberate deprivation and neglect within a system Joseph created and controlled. As the case moved through the justice system, Elizabeth provided videotaped testimony on July 11, 2008. It was recorded so she would not have to face Joseph directly in open court, and it became a central part of what jurors would later see. The trial began on March 16, 2009 in the city of St. Pölten. Judge Andrea Humer presided. By then, the case had already shocked the world, and the attention surrounding it was intense. But the courtroom proceedings themselves were handled with restrictions, because the details were so extreme and the victims' privacy was a major concern. At the start, Joseph pleaded guilty to all charges except murder and grievous assault relating to threats. Even after everything had been uncovered, even with the physical evidence of the cellar and the DNA results, he initially held back on full responsibility for certain parts of the case. Jurors watched 11 hours of Elizabeth's recorded testimony, but they couldn't watch it all at once. It was shown in segments due to the severity of what it contained. That alone tells you something. This wasn't testimony people could casually sit through. It was a record of years of abuse, control, and confinement, described by the person who lived it. During the trial, it was reported that Elizabeth attended one day in disguise. She did not plan to see her father again, but she was reportedly present, watching. It's a detail that speaks to the complexity of trauma and justice, because for some survivors, the courtroom is not just about conviction. It's about reality being acknowledged in a place where lies can no longer stand. On March 18th, Joseph changed his plea to guilty on all charges. That shift meant the trial moved toward its conclusion with the full weight of his admissions on record. But even then, the prosecution emphasized what the words alone could never fully communicate: the physical conditions of the cellar. The prosecutor described the hidden chamber as damp and moldy. The court heard descriptions of the environment that matched what investigators found: an underground space with poor air and artificial light, a place never meant to hold human beings for years at a time. The prosecutor demonstrated the low ceiling height to jurors, emphasizing the physical confinement, the discomfort, and the oppressive nature of the space. And then, on March 19, 2009, Joseph Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment, with parole possible after 15 years. It was the maximum sentence in a system that still allows for the possibility of parole after a set period. But the conviction itself was definitive: guilty, across the charges tied to decades of imprisonment, sexual violence, coercion, and the death of an infant. Legally, the case reached its endpoint. But for Elizabeth and her children, the end of the trial wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of what comes after survival. After Joseph's arrest, Elizabeth, her children, and Rosemary were taken into care. They received therapy and medical treatment. They were removed from public view, protected as much as possible, because the world's fascination with the case was immediate and relentless. The children faced adjustment issues that were deeply specific to what they had lived through. Light, space, ordinary sounds, the closing of doors, the dimming of lights, things that most people barely notice, could trigger anxiety and fear. After years of captivity defined by locked barriers and punishment, even normal environments could feel unsafe. Authorities offered the family new identities, and it was emphasized that the choice was theirs. The goal was protection, privacy, and the possibility of a future that wasn't permanently tied to the most infamous details of their past. Years later, the physical house itself became part of the aftermath. The cellar was later filled with concrete in 2013, and the property was sold in 2016. The structure that held the secret for so long was altered permanently, as if the town itself needed to ensure that particular space could never be used again. Joseph Fritzl later changed his name to Joseph Mehrhoff in 2017. As for later legal developments involving prison placement and release requests, the full details are unknown, not confirmed beyond what was provided here, though it is noted that there were 2024 developments involving approvals to move him and the rejection of a nursing home request. But the most important part of this story was never the paperwork, or the name change, or even the courtroom verdict. It was the scale of what happened, and how long it went undetected. A young woman disappeared in 1984, and the world accepted a simple explanation. A runaway, a cult, a family tragedy. And beneath that ordinary surface, an extraordinary crime continued for 24 years, hidden inside a home that looked like any other. The failure to detect it wasn't just one mistake. It was a chain of assumptions, blind spots, and accepted stories that allowed one man to build a private prison under his own family's life, and the survival of Elizabeth and her children, through years that should have broken them, remains one of the most haunting and important truths to come out of this case. Because the rescue was only the beginning, and surviving something like this is a lifelong aftermath. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe, thank you for watching.